second meeting of the Special Committee on the Economic Relationship between Canada and the United States. This is our second meeting, but our first meeting with witnesses. So really excited to have the officials here with us today. I'm not sure who's speaking, but whoever is speaking, you now have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Michael Grant. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Americas, and I'll be giving the opening remarks. I'm joined by my colleague, Steve Verhoel, Assistant Deputy Minister for Trade Policy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. As members of this special committee will already know, Canada and the United States have long enjoyed a special relationship. Our two countries enjoy the largest trading relationship in the world. We defend and protect North America together. We are stewards of our shared environment. We stand on the world stage to respond to pressing global challenges together. Mr. Chair, these are not just merely words. We've just committed to revitalizing and expanding our ties with the United States in order to realize our relationship's full potential.
Last week, the Prime Minister and President Joe Biden announced the roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership, a blueprint for an ambitious and whole-of-government effort against the COVID-19 pandemic and in support of our mutual prosperity. It creates a partnership on climate change, advances global health security, bolsters cooperation on defense and security, and it reaffirms a shared commitment to diversity, equity, and justice. The government has quickly begun operationalizing the roadmap through virtual meetings and calls between our country's leaders. In addition to phone calls and the meeting between Prime Minister Trudeau and the President and Vice President, we've seen Ministers Garneau, Wilkinson, and Alghabra all speak with their counterparts just in the last week. And we expect more to come this week and beyond.
To briefly touch on a few priority themes in the Canada-U.S. relationship. Foremost, our leaders have agreed that both countries' fundamental priority is to end the global pandemic. The spread of COVID-19 has caused upheaval in both Canada and the United States. Consider last March, Canada and the United States arrived at a far-reaching agreement to limit discretionary and recreational travel across the border, an understanding that has been extended by mutual agreement. This collaboration set the tone for subsequent cooperation, including in getting our citizens home, ensuring continued operation of our supply chains, and assisting each other in the production and procurement of medical supplies and other essential goods. Our work together in managing the flow of goods amid the pandemic is just one facet of the deeply interconnected economic relationship between Canada and the United States. This enduring trade relationship that has been a model of success for the world for many years, starting with the Canada-US FTA in 1989, continuing with NAFTA in 1994, and culminating today in the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA. Of course, we have more work to do, guided by the new roadmap. For example, Canada and the United States will build a strategy to strengthen supply chain security and will also accelerate joint initiatives to support the recovery of small and medium-sized enterprises. Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement...
Mr. Chair, the government also recognizes the critical role that energy plays in our trading relationship. Canada is the United States' #1 foreign supplier of all forms of energy, including crude oil, natural gas, hydroelectricity, and uranium. Secure, affordable, and sustainably produced energy. Energy underpins our exports. It supports the economy, jobs, and competitiveness on both sides of the border. It provides energy security and resiliency to North America. In the new roadmap, our two countries have recognized this. We've also agreed on the importance of our highly integrated energy infrastructure. Completing new and expanded cross-border energy infrastructure will fuel our economies and provide clean, renewable energy. Supporting Line 5's continued operation remains a top priority now and in the future through Enbridge's tunnel project. We work tirelessly through Canada's diplomatic network in the U.S. to promote and strengthen this energy relationship and to support projects like Line 5.
And security. Canada and the United States collaborated closely on defense, both at home and abroad. Collective security is a shared responsibility. Canadians and Americans have depended on each other for decades. Looking ahead, we will be expanding our cooperation on continental defense and in the Arctic, including by modernizing the North American Aerospace Defense Command and launching an expanded US-Canada Arctic dialogue. A further element that unites us in our is our shared natural environment. Canada and the US share many waterways that mark or cross our shared border, from the Great Lakes to rivers such as the mighty St. Lawrence. And moving forward under the new roadmap, we will do more, like launching a high-level climate ministerial to increase our climate ambitions aligned to the Paris Agreement and net zero objectives while holding polluters accountable for their actions. En lançant la nouvelle feuille de route,
In launching the new roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership, our leaders said it best in their joint quote. The partnership between the United States and Canada endures because we invest in each other's success. Mr. Chairman, Canada welcomes the roadmap as a way to revitalize and expand our ties with the United States as we continue to work closely as partners, friends, allies, and neighbors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. I appreciate your opening comments. We will now start the first round of questions. The first question goes to Mr. Hoback for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Grant, and it's nice to see Mr. Verhul here also. This is a great topic, and I'm glad to be part of this committee. I think there's lots of great things we can do. You know, one thing on the last negotiations, and Mr. Verhul, you probably agree with me, we learned was this relationship with the U.S. is one that we have to keep fostering, we have to keep renewing and keep working with all the time. We can't take anything for granted. And of course, one of the things that we're looking at here right now is this proposal for the roadmap for renewal U.S.-Canada. So my first question to you, Mr. Grant, in regards to that, what was the process in developing this roadmap? What did you go through? Who did you consult with? Who was involved in this process as you put this together?
thank you very much for the question. In terms of conducting or constructing the roadmap, there were contacts between various departments, as well as between, in the United States, the National Security Council, and on our side, the Privy Council Office, as well as Prime Minister's Office and the White House. It was a collective effort, and tough to say who held the pen, but it was coordinated centrally by PCO and PMO with the input from many departments, and the same on the US side.
So there's been no consultation done outside of government in regards to the acceptance of this roadmap.
In terms of getting to the announcement of the roadmap, I think it was mostly done internally amongst officials and with our American friends. But it's there for everyone to see, and will certainly be part of the engagement with all Canadians as we move forward.
Okay, moving on to Line 5, of course, that has serious consequences here in Canada and Sarnia, and of course out in Western Canada. Is there anything in our international agreements going back to 1977, the treaty between Canada and the U.S., concerning pipelines that make sure that the state of Michigan can't unilaterally shut down this pipeline? I lost volume.
Very sorry. Thank you for the question. Right now, federal government is working very closely with Enbridge, mostly through mobilizing our diplomatic network in the United States to engage state of Michigan, as well as other states that have vested interest in Line 5. We are also looking at all of our options that are available, including the 1977 treaty, and we're doing so in close collaboration with Enbridge. We also have a vibrant discussion going on with provinces, as it's in everyone's interest that we see this resolved as expeditiously as possible.
Yeah, I'm concerned because if one state's allowed to do this to Line 5, what's preventing another sector being at the mercy of a state doing that to their sector? So uh, let's say cattlemen in North Dakota, all of a sudden North Dakota says we don't want Canadian cattle. Uh, does that mean they can unilaterally do that? So I'm just kind of curious, under CUSMA, uh, did we put any measures in place to even enhance the 1977 agreement? And what are those options that you're looking at in regards to ensuring that we do everything we can to protect our interests?
Thanks. I think Steve might want to come in on the question regarding CUSMA, but in terms of looking at all our options, it's exactly that. As you may know, there are processes in state court in Michigan as well as in federal court. We do see this as a state-to-state issue between government of Canada and the government of the United States. This issue was raised in the recent meetings last week to ensure that the United States realizes the importance of Line 5 to Canada, and we'll continue to look at all possible options going forward. Steve, did you want to comment on the CUSMA aspect?
Sure, and thank you. Yes, certainly we do have provisions in CUSMA that could come into play on these issues, particularly in relation to investment obligations. But I think that, as Michael has pointed out, this is not really the route that we want to go right now. I think that we don't want to enter a long dispute that's going to take a very long time to resolve, along with the potential result that may not bring us what we want. So our focus at the moment is to try to advocate very strongly, to put pressure on the U.S. Government and others to ensure that this doesn't actually come into play. So that's our focus for the moment.
Mr. Grant, you said in your roadmap, you talked about energy infrastructure and putting in place new energy infrastructure. Of course, we've seen things like Keystone being shut down in the U.S. So, what does this new infrastructure look like? Who's involved with it, and what's the intent behind it?
Thank you very much for the question. Well, first and foremost, it's also about protecting existing infrastructure, and Line 5 is exactly well, it's a prime example of it. In terms of new infrastructure, I can say that Canada is a significant exporter of hydroelectricity to the United States, and there are many opportunities in hydroelectricity to expand that export. So I think as we look at both ensuring our collective energy security, as well as looking at our efforts to collectively protect the environment and combat climate change, hydroelectricity provides an excellent example going forward.
So then when we
So,
look
Mr.
at
Hovak, sorry, your time is up. Sorry about that. Hopefully we'll pick it
okay,
up
thanks,
after.
sir. Thanks,
Okay,
witnesses.
that's okay. Next up is Ms. Mendayan for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our officials who are appearing as witnesses today. Always a pleasure to see you again, Mr. Verhoel, and Mr. Grant. I might start with you. I have read that in November 2020, Premier Kenney said that the death of Line 5 would be devastating. Anybody who wants to cut off Alberta oil and gas exports would be, and I quote, brain dead. And 1 week later, Governor Whitmer took legal action to shut down Line 5. I'm wondering, in your experience, obviously extensive experience and expertise in Canada-U.S. relations, Was a statement like that by Premier Kenney helpful?
Thank you very much for the question. I'll say I think it's important for the United States, the various actors, whether at the state level or at the federal level, and again, multiple states, because while this has a direct impact on Michigan, Ohio, New York also would be implicated. I think it's important that Canadian views are very well known. Um, as I recall, Governor Whitmer had campaigned on this particular issue, so while the particular action maybe came as a bit of a surprise in terms of when it came out, I don't think we were terribly surprised that she was going to take action in that regard. Um, I think it's important going forward that that Canada, the federal government, provincial governments, certainly the private sector and others, continue to make our voice heard and known amongst all of the decision makers and influence makers in the United States.
Thank you, and I would certainly agree that it is useful to engage in constructive dialogue and make our position known. And I guess to that end, and picking up on what Mr. Hoback was mentioning earlier, the two of us sit on International Trade Committee, and we worked very hard to ensure the ratification of CUSMA. And in CUSMA, there was a Team Canada approach, a very thoughtful and strategic engagement of the United States on many different levels. And obviously we are dealing with something on a smaller scale with respect to one state in particular, but perhaps yourself or Mr. Verhoel can expand a little bit on the engagement strategy through different layers of government between Canada and the United States in order to make sure that that Canada's position is well known and that we are making every effort in order to engage the United States on Line 5.
Thank you very much for the question. I mentioned that last week in the high-level meetings, Line 5 was raised, Canada's concern regarding the intent of the state of Michigan and the fact that we will vigorously defend the ability of Enbridge to continue to operate that line. Our engagement in the U.S. is really multifaceted. I mentioned our diplomatic offices. We have, of course, the embassy in Washington, but our consulates general in Detroit and New York are quite active in engaging, first and foremost, the governments, sitting governments, but also legislators, as well as those key industries, companies that rely, as much as we do in Canada, on those resources that are brought by Line 5. Some of those stakeholders that we engage with include labor, which have a very important voice. There would be significant disruption in the United States on this, and collectively, we need to continue to make sure that that message is heard. I mentioned earlier at the officials level, we have a regular dialogue with provinces to ensure that they have an understanding of our approach, and also to ensure that again we're all on the same page in terms of our engagement, because I believe that's necessary.
Mr. Chair, if I have time for one more question. I, of course, followed very closely the lengthy bilateral of last week between President Biden and our Prime Minister, as I'm sure you did as well. And I wonder, obviously, given your experience, if you could speak a little bit to the uniqueness of that meeting and the synergies between our two countries with this new administration. I do feel as if it was quite the groundbreaking meeting, a real reset of our relationship. Perhaps I can let you elaborate.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would agree. I think it was a rather unique, even though virtual, I think it was a rather unique, not just one meeting, but a set of meetings. And it's been very interesting as we see American secretaries get confirmed virtually across the board. The first person they're speaking to after being confirmed is their Canadian counterpart. And I think this goes to the importance of the relationship, not only that we see, but also the Biden administration. Coming out of the meeting between leaders, what the roadmap kicks off is a very significant to-do list for both governments. While it's focused in certain areas, it covers a lot of what we do together. And there is probably more alignment between Canada and the United States than there has been in several years. And I would also argue that the ambition level, the shared ambition level, probably hasn't been this high in a few years. So from an official perspective that works on Canada-US, it's quite an exciting time, and we look forward to the work to come.
Sorry, Ms. Bendam, your time is done. Next is Monsieur Savard-Tremblay. Vous avez 6 minutes pour votre question.
Bonjour. Mr. Tremblay, you have 6 minutes. Good afternoon, colleagues and witnesses. Thank you for your presentation. So at the beginning of this issue, some people said, and this was laid to companies, that the tentative of the Michigan government was violating the 1977 agreement between Canada and the U.S. on transit pipelines. Do you agree with that? Thank you for this question. As I mentioned, we're looking at all options currently to change that situation. Even the 1977 agreement. We really would like that the state of Michigan and Enbridge could find a solution without having to go to the courts and without using other processes. But we know that there are other tools that we can use, including the 1977 agreement. So I'd like to ask you if this agreement would prevent, so to speak, these attempts by the state of Michigan. What is the likelihood that Michigan succeeds in what they're trying to do? Thank you for the question. Really, this will depend on several things. But our priority is to find a solution, a friendly solution between Michigan and Enbridge. And as I said, we will use all possible tools to achieve this. If it's necessary to use the 1977 agreement, we will use it. But at this stage, we're working with the company, with the provinces, in order to get the officials, the American officials involved to find a solution. And if we look at this, what is the likelihood that Michigan would succeed? They're quite low. We look at the company that's really taking a long time to correct some gaps in its infrastructure that in several cases are very close to watercourses. Should the actions not be centered on that aspect? Thank you for the question. We're looking at this situation as being an issue between both federal governments, the American government and the Canadian government. So, of course, what we want is a amicable solution between the state of Michigan and Enbridge. But we already have a dialogue with the American federal government. And as I said, if it's necessary to have recourse to that agreement, we do have that possibility. Well, thank you. I do understand that. but so we're only working at the relationship between both countries, that agreement has to be respected. But on the Enbridge side, there are some gaps that haven't been corrected. So to what degree can the federal government have a true relationship of power if this company is taking a long time to correct these lacks, these deficiencies? Thank you again for the question. It's quite possible that I'm not the person who has all the answers. I think that it's a very specific issue, so I don't have an answer, but I could consult my colleagues. And if I can, I would come back with an answer later. Yes, thank you. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left before I ask my next question?
1 minute.
So, I don't know if maybe another witness could add something on the topic that I just raised on my last question. No? Okay, so then I will ask another question. I'm wondering, well, there's very little likelihood that Michigan might be able to close the line or shut down the line. I don't know if the company should not correct some deficiencies. So where's the urgencies there in the sense that there's very small likelihood that the line be closed or be shut down? If I've understood your question clearly, it was the Michigan governor who declared a deadline for the operation of Line 5.
There are
Vont dérouler.
And these processes can go out. There is an emergency, but we do have some time still to find an amicable solution. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr. Blakey for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. In respect of Line 5, there's at least two important ways in which this issue is different than issues like the Keystone XL pipeline, for instance, or the Trans Mountain pipeline. One of those differences in the view of the NDP is that we're talking about a project that is existing infrastructure. It doesn't depend, it's not predicated upon increasing the rate of extraction or the amount of barrels per day. It's what we're already doing. And the second important distinction as well is that this is a pipeline that's part and parcel of Canadians being able to do value-added work, which they're unfortunately often not able to do. We've seen a significant reduction in refining and upgrading within Canada over the last 20 or 30 years. So as we look to this project and as we look to hopefully what will be an era of better cooperation between Canada and the U.S. on the climate change front, I'm just wondering, what are some of the ways in which you think Canada, in the context of a larger North American energy strategy, can be advocating to have those kinds of value-added jobs so that Canada isn't simply the supplier of raw resource to the United States where the upgrading and refining occurs, but what are the opportunities for Canada to ensure that we're doing value-added work here and getting the benefits of the employment that comes with that secondary kind of work?
Thanks very much for the question. Steve might want to come in after my response. And just to note, it wasn't specific to your question, but just to note that Line 5 this isn't about increasing; it's about maintaining. And we are also quite concerned, and this is part of our advocacy with influence makers and officials in the United States, of the implication of transporting that quantity of resources via other means, such as rail or truck. The obvious risks involved there. But I think in terms of an integrated North American or bilateral energy market, that's exactly the point that you're getting to, is the importance of ensuring that Canadian companies are taking advantage at both the front end and at the back end. We've talked about hydroelectricity, but there is also renewables. Canadian companies have a lot to offer the United States in terms of their desire to develop this market. And we see tremendous potential for Canadians in doing so. At the same time, with more significant, more secure, and climate friendly energy supply down the road, this will also improve the attractiveness of investment in Canada and continue to build our ties outside of North America. Steve, did you want to come in?
I think you really captured it, Michael. I think the Line 5 issue is really about maintaining that particular avenue, as you mentioned. We do have a number of efforts underway to try to make sure that the new opening we have with the U.S. administration gives us the possibility of putting in more value added on the Canadian side when it comes to some of these resources that we're selling around the world. And I think that's something that we're focused on quite intently in terms of trying to maximize our benefits on that front.
When we look at the question of Buy America, I'm wondering, I mean, I think everybody around this table would share a sense of disappointment that we don't have a blanket exemption to Buy America. I know many of us were hoping to see that come out of the last rounds of negotiation in CUSMA, for instance. But I'm wondering, when we talk about partnership on climate change and the extent to which the North American economy is integrated, if we're not able to secure a blanket exemption from Buy America policies, if you see particularly climate friendly initiatives, so whether it's electric bus manufacture in Canada or other kinds of industry and products that Canada has to offer that would contribute to this united front in the battle against climate change, do you see that as being an avenue for securing certain types of exemption from Buy America by way of climate if we're not able to do it across the board? And has there been any kind of discussion along those lines to date?
Michael, I'll go ahead on this if you're okay. Yes, no, certainly with respect to Buy America, I think the excuse me, the prospects of us getting a complete exemption from the Buy America provisions is something that's not likely to be politically possible in the U.S. So we are taking the approach that we're trying to focus on specific areas of interest, specific areas where we can work with the U.S. And start to develop areas where we can put a lot of value added on it. So when it comes to Buy America, we're looking at key sectors. We're looking at where our key objectives are. And I think when it comes to the whole issue of climate friendly processes or products, that's a major focus that we're looking at, because that's, I think, where we can very easily align with the US, demonstrate that those markets, like many others, are very integrated, and that we can produce a lot of those types of goods and services together, and we're much more reliable suppliers to each other than potentially other countries might be. So that is a major focus at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. So that ends round one. So we will now begin the second round with Ms. Alistair for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to our witnesses for such an important conversation. I'd like to start with some of the thoughts around COVID and the comments that you made around that being a priority on the to-do list, and that up till now we've had a cooperative agreement between the US and Canada on the production and procurement of critical medical supplies. And I'm wondering if now the conversation has begun around how we might secure some of the vaccines that are currently being produced in the US. Could you share the progress on that conversation?
I'll thank you very much for the question. I'll take a crack, and then Steve, if you want to come in, that's fine. I think just going back to the roadmap and the discussions last week, I think what you see is a pretty comprehensive um, engagement on all things COVID. That includes, ministers and officials from a slew of departments, whether it's on the health side, whether it's on the border side, just really ramping up their engagement. When it comes to vaccines, to my understanding, we have an agreement with the company for the provision of 20 million vaccines from the United States. And as it stands, we're looking forward to those deliveries, and we have not seen anything to indicate that there would be any disruption to that. Steve, do you want to come in?
Well, only to add that certainly, as you described, Michael, there's work going on the vaccine side, but I think that the issue that I'm more focused on, and some of our teams are more focused on, is how we make sure that we're in the same space as the U.S. when it comes to what we're both going to be doing on COVID recovery, the economic issues related to that, and the whole issue of building back better, which also draws in the economy, the environment, and climate change issues that have been mentioned before. So, um, all about the integrated economy, resilient supply chains. Those are the kinds of issues that we're focusing on. Obviously, the vaccines is a priority, but there's much more that we're doing with the U.S. in relation to COVID and its implications.
So perhaps you could share some of the terms and conditions. What will the criteria be in terms of your conversations with the US about when and how the border will open up?
Well, we have not set a specific point in time when the border will open up. As you know, the border is open for essential services now. So we are having trade going back and forth to a very significant degree. But what's being restricted is visits and people coming back and forth across for more personal reasons or visits or vacations, that kind of thing. We're focused on making sure that the economic trade that goes back and forth between Canada and the US is preserved, and that has been preserved. But we're still restricting the travel for other reasons, and we intend to continue to do that.
And my question, sir, was around the criteria and conditions, because there are businesses in my riding that are indicating that there still are challenges, significant challenges getting across the border. It is impacting their ability to do business and their economic security and viability. So Canada needs the border to open up, not at the risk of any kind of health safety. So we recognize there's no time. But the real question is, what are the conversations? What are the criteria that we'll use? How will we know when we might be able to? What kinds of things need to be in place, be it numbers of vaccines or numbers of infections, or give us an idea so that we can start to understand what those criteria and milestones need to be in the conversations that you're having with the US.
Well, that's certainly something that's beyond where I work. I'm focused more on the economic side of things, and am not involved in those kinds of issues. I know that when there are issues related to companies that are or businesses that are trying to get back and forth across the border, there are processes in place to try to ensure that we are allowing that trade to continue. Um, when we'll get back to normal, all of those other kinds of issues are more up to the health authorities and more up to certainly uh, other people that are more directly involved in those issues than I am.
but in order to understand our economic future, we'll have to have some conversation about what those criteria are. So I'll look forward to any information that you might get on that topic in the future. But before we leave that, could I talk quickly about the strategy to strengthen supply chain security? Could you give us some insight into how you define supply chain security and therefore what some of the key elements would be around that strategy?
A 15-second answer, just above time.
Sorry, Michael, did you want to take that or do you want?
Over to you, Steve.
Okay, well, when it comes to supply chain security, we are having ongoing discussions with the US because I think both of us are concerned about the kinds of disruptions we saw, particularly in the earlier stages of the pandemic, and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So we're having discussions about how we can make sure that our supply chains are going to be more secure, how we can ensure that our own integrated markets can perform a lot of those functions, and maybe we can expand it even further so that we can have full confidence in each other in terms of having secure supply chains. And it's really about looking at where you're getting your supply from, and we are certainly a secure supplier. Um, Looking at countries where you may not have that same level of comfort and seeing where there are other options. And those are the kinds of issues that we're looking at now.
Thank you, Ms. Ellslav. Mr. Schreiber,
you.
5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I want to commend you for always coming out to these trade-related committees and giving your well thought out answers and insight into what's happening. I agree with what Mr. Grant had said and Mr. Verrill as well, is not to antagonize our neighbors to the south and to hopefully work out a diplomatic solution or a negotiated solution. But there are provisions, I believe, ISDS. We still have 3 years under USMCS and MCA and other protective measures. I think under our trade agreements that we can protect such arrangements. My curiosity is when it comes to Line 5, is the governor of Michigan more concerned just with that one particular the Straits of Mackinac component? And I understand a permit which the state has given to bore tunnels underneath to have a more protective layer. Is her attitude on this that if that is done, she's okay? She's forcing this decision to get the replacement encased, and if that is in a satisfactory manner, she doesn't have an objection to the line overall, or is her objection to the complete line and fossil fuels in general?
Thank you very much. Far be it from me to speak on behalf of the governor of Michigan, but from our assessment, the concern is over the Line 5 that passes under the Straits of Mackinac. There has been a process underway to get approvals for the tunnel that would eventually replace this line, essentially a building of the tunnel and then a new pipelines put underneath. That processing is proceeding. As I understand it, Enbridge estimates that if in the best case scenario, that would only come online in 2024. So hence the concern over a disruption between the ceasing of the Line 5 and when that comes online. And so that's our understanding of it. And yes, there are various provisions that we could turn to. And as I've said, we are looking at all options, and we will ensure that all options that are needed are employed in order to find a resolution to this issue.
Thank you. My next question would be in terms of the Buy America, and this I guess relates predominantly to federal procurement and infrastructure projects. If so, what is the dollar figure that is at risk for Canadians, Canadian businesses that are already doing procurement in the U.S. or infrastructure building, and what's the risk that we're facing, so we can quantify it and know how much energy to put onto this?
Well, Yes, no, sorry. It's very difficult to actually quantify that risk. I think with the initial executive order that President Biden announced, um, we are largely exempted from the provisions related to Buy American under that provision. So we're not too concerned about that, or at least not as concerned. What we're more concerned about is the upcoming infrastructure bill that the administration is working on, which could include up to $2 trillion worth of infrastructure spending, much of which would go down to state governments and municipal governments. And we do not have a waiver with respect to those kinds of products. So we would, unless we get this right, or unless we get some kinds of special considerations or exemptions or waivers, um, we would lose the opportunity to be able to compete on projects under that infrastructure bill, which obviously is quite large. But we are focused on talking to the US about this. They've indicated there's an open door to consult on potential implications. They recognize the integrated market and the kind of disruption they could cause by insisting on Buy American across the board. So we're going to be taking a very detailed look at all of this to ensure that our interests can be covered off under this infrastructure bill once it's approved in the U.S.
15 seconds, Mr. Strike. Quick question.
Just quick question. So in terms of there could be able to do something in terms of content, quantity, just like cars, if a percentage is American built, obviously the material, concrete, steel, etc., would mostly be from the United States. But if Canada can get an exemption, so we're probably providing more services in those regards. Is that something we're looking at?
It is. We do think that we will be certainly making the case that the U.S. doesn't produce enough steel or aluminum on its own. There are issues around concrete. There are issues around transportation infrastructure, around wastewater management, all those kinds of issues where Canada supplies a lot of important elements to the U.S. And we will be looking to try to work something out that works in both of our interests and maintains the integrated market in those areas.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sarai. Monsieur Savard Tremblay pour 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Given that the presentation did talk about vaccines a little bit, I was wondering if we could go a little further in terms of agreements with the U.S. on this issue. Most recently, we saw that there were, of course, that most of the doses were not coming from the U.S. So have we progressed there? Thank you for the question. I'm not the expert on this matter, but I think we do have a contract with an American company for 20 million doses. I don't have the details of when and how, and I think there's no problem with that contract. And with the other vaccines coming from other countries that go through the U.S., there haven't been no problems so far. And with the preceding American administration, there was a decree adopted that granted priority for vaccination to the Americans. That decree, unless I'm mistaken, is still in operation. So have there been any undertakings on that question? During meetings last week, both countries agreed on the importance of protecting our populations and will continue to do this. Currently, it includes the supply of vaccines, but it's a contract between the Canadian government and a private company. And we will continue to follow this situation. It's very important for us to ensure a supply of vaccines for Canadians. You're saying it's an agreement between the Canadian government and an American corporation. And I respect what you're saying, that you don't have the expertise to answer. But you're saying, despite this American decree, there's no problem in terms of the 20 million doses? Did I understand that clearly? What I can say is that there is an agreement between the two governments that all of our people must be protected by a vaccine. And currently, we don't see any problem with the contract between the Canadian government and the American corporation. But it's something very important, and we'll continue to entertain a dialogue with the American authorities. Thank you, Mr. Savard-Tremblay.
Thank you very much. When we talk about supply chain resiliency, particularly for things like medical equipment and services, wondering what the nature of the discussion is. I mean, I think one of the things we saw early on in the pandemic was interference in the States with the provision of some PPE, and that was cause for concern, and that I don't know that there's anything you can do to ever completely eliminate that concern, except to have as part of your strategy the production of certain necessary items like that in your own country. And so I'm wondering the extent to which those, if we're talking about supply chains within North America, if we're actually sitting down at the table to have a strategy to ensure that a sufficient amount of those things are actually being produced in Canada as part of a strategy to ensure that we have adequate supply on the continent, but that each partner is actually producing some of what's needed, so that we're not just talking about hoping to have another agreement that we can have faith in and then see what happens when a crisis occurs, as we've already seen, and we've seen how that can go sideways, or whether we're actually talking about having a plan particularly for certain types of goods, as we've seen recently, so that we're not just hoping that things go well when a crisis occurs, but we actually have a mutually agreeable plan to ensure that countries are able to look out for their own interest as well, and aren't simply reliant on manufacturing capability outside its own borders. Could you speak a little bit to the nature of the discussion and the extent to which that's part of it?
Steve, would you like to take that?
Well, I haven't been directly involved in a lot of that. I think that what we've been looking at is that the U.S. has indicated an openness to have further discussions in that direction. When we look back at what we did on PPE and on ventilators early in all of this, we did succeed in making sure that we had a consistent supply from the U.S., despite some concerns at the time. And we did get that supply. So there are ways for us to work this out, but I think that it will involve further conversations. As to what we can produce at home, I think that most governments around the world are now looking at what they consider to be essential in terms of domestic production to avoid some of the complications that we found during this crisis. So obviously, that exploration is going to continue, and it will continue in Canada as well. But that's a bit more of a long-term issue.
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. Now, can we go to Mr. Straw for 5 minutes, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is regarding the softwood lumber agreement. Prime Minister Trudeau has now been Prime Minister under 3 different U.S. administrations. I think certainly from our perspective, he missed a great opportunity to negotiate a softwood lumber agreement with President Obama. Last 4 years have obviously been more challenging in terms of trade, but now with this reset, as was mentioned, or the new roadmap. I don't see anything in the roadmap about softwood lumber. So I'm just wondering, are we once again putting that on the back burner, or do you have a mandate to negotiate a new softwood lumber agreement for Canadians?
Well, we are certainly prepared to enter negotiations with the U.S. on a new softwood lumber agreement at any point in time. The challenge we have is if we don't have a willing partner on the other side. Now, that may change as the U.S. administration gets more up to speed, as we have the new USTR confirmed, and she starts to take on a lot of these files. But over the last number of years, there has been no appetite on the part of the U.S. to enter into a negotiation, and the U.S. industry continues to press them to not enter into such negotiations. So that's the reason we've been taking the approach of continually challenging U.S. decisions on softwood lumber duties, largely winning in most of those cases. We now have 6 cases underway, both at the WTO and under our CUSMA agreement. So we're building up pressure to try to convince the U.S. to re-enter a negotiation, but so far we have not had a willing partner on that side.
Are either of you aware, did the Prime Minister raise the issue of softwood lumber with President Biden on either his initial call or during the bilateral meetings?
I'm certainly aware that it was raised. I'm not sure in which context. I think it was raised in more than one context. I wouldn't want to state definitively whether the Prime Minister himself raised it or not. I would expect so, but I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, I didn't see it in either one of the readouts or in the reporting on it from the Prime Minister's office, but perhaps it was raised and just not reported. I've seen some analysis that says that the America First procurement policies of President Biden could hit us harder than the provisions in Trump's renegotiated NAFTA. Do you agree that the impact of if they were to shut down or severely limit the ability of Canadian products or producers to engage in U.S. infrastructure could have even a greater impact than some of the trade actions that were taken by the previous administration?
Well, we don't really know yet because we haven't seen any kind of details around what they might intend to do on infrastructure. I think what's important and what we're taking as a positive signal is that the U.S. administration has said that we want to consult with Canada as they move towards designing and implementing that particular program. They're looking at the North American market as well. They're very much aware of the integration of our economies, and that if they did have a strict Buy America kind of approach, it would be costly because we supply a lot of the goods that go into the products that they're looking for.
Sorry, briefly, have you been given a mandate to fight back against Buy America at the officials level, or would it be similar to Keystone XL, where once the U.S. administration makes a decision, the Canadian government just throws in the towel and accepts that result?
Well, I'm not going to comment on that, but I will say that what we're trying to do on Buy America and Buy American is make sure that we have the proper kinds of relationships with the new U.S. administration, that we can have these kinds of conversations. They have opened that door, so we're starting to have them. And there's an openness to make sure that they don't take actions that are going to cause damage to us in ways that we would certainly have difficulty with. So there's an open door to try to work this out the best way we can. And that's what we're focused on, trying to make sure that we do not face the kinds of damages that we could potentially face if the U.S. was to go it entirely alone.
Thank you, Mr. Strahl. And for the final question, we'll go to Mr. McKay for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Grant and Mr. Verhul. Both of you are outstanding civil servants, and we deeply appreciate the work you put in. I wanted to link 2 ideas and get your comments. And the first
idea has been greatly discussed here, namely Buy American. And the second idea hasn't been discussed as much, and that is the security exemption we have for primarily for defense. And I want to ask the question in the context of a conversation I had earlier today with a representative of Boeing. And the representative of Boeing pointed out that Boeing has been in Canada for 107 years. He considers Boeing to be a Canadian company. And everyone on this call has seen the massive amounts of business that Boeing does both back and forth. And some of Boeing's products, of course, fall within the security exemptions of defense, but many of them don't fall in the exemption. So my first question is, are we defining, for the purposes of the trade arrangements between Canada and the U.S., security in a too narrow fashion? And in fact, our economies are so intimately integrated that the security exemption should not merely be related to um, items that are clearly defense orientated. And let me give you an example. Those of us who live in southern Ontario a few years ago had a huge blackout, and it lasted 2 or 3 days, primarily because of a failure of infrastructure in the United States. Now, that is a security failure. And of course, with the advances of cyber and artificial intelligence and things of that nature, this becomes a far greater risk to all of us and to our well-being. So I'm wondering whether there is areas of discussion that could be entered into as you gentlemen sit at the table with your American counterparts, that security is at this point too narrowly defined and that it is continually bumping up against the risks to both of our nations.
You want me to start, Michael?
Please.
Okay. Well, yes. No, I think that certainly is a point that we've been thinking about quite a bit, because I think clearly on the defense side, there are arrangements in place. There is a much clearer kind of situation that exists there. But what we've been looking at most recently, and we've been having discussions with the U.S. about this, is the whole notion of security in a different sense when we talk about supply chain security, when we talk about supply chain resiliency, when we talk about critical minerals we might supply to the U.S. and important imports we get from them. So it is security in a different kind of sense, but it is something that we're spending much more time on because we both want to have secure sources of supply that will allow our economy to function without getting into some of the difficulties we've seen, and supply chain security can lead to that. And Canada and the U.S. being such long-standing secure economic partners, it's ideal for the kinds of products that we trade back and forth to have that kind of situation exist where we're doing this on a security basis. So definitely something that we've been talking about.
Mr. Grant, do you have anything to offer?
I would just add that I thank you for the suggestion. I think that's creative thinking. And I think, as we begin what is a clear new direction with the United States, looking at virtually all aspects of our relationship with a fairly high ambition level, I think that's certainly a creative idea that we can inject into the mix going forward. There's a lot of interrelated aspects to what you put forward, including where we will soon be embarking on a review of NORAD and a modernization of NORAD, which will demonstrate, the importance of our collective security. And again, it's a little bit apples and oranges, but I think it's a very, very interesting idea. Thank you.
I understand the negotiations with respect
Quick
to
question,
NORAD
Mr.
and what a
Question.
sorry.
Quick
Oh,
question.
okay. Well, if I have an autonomous car and there's a breakdown in a U.S. Electricity grid, and I end up in the ditch. Um, that's a pretty major security concern that I have. Or if my water system is poisoned by by a cyber switch, that's a pretty serious concern, and it's a concern on both sides of the Great Lakes. So I leave those as examples of real examples for both of you. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
If I may have the indulgence from the committee, I would like to ask one question, and it's more of a technical question to either witness. One of the disputes with Line 5 is that the government revoked the license for Line 5 in association with the Michigan Department of Resources. And one of the arguments that has been put forward by Enbridge is that they're regulated by a federal regulator, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. So I'm just wondering, in a short answer, I mean, obviously this has to play out in their internal court system. What can we be doing um, in the interim to support the process while this is going through the legal process?
It's a very good question, and I apologize, but I don't think I have the expertise to answer it specifically. Only to say that, as we move forward, there is a process going on in the state court in Michigan, as well as processes in the federal court, and we look at this very much as a state-to-state issue, and we'll continue to do so. So we'll continue to work with Enbridge very closely going forward. And I think on that particular issue, I'll have to defer a specific response. But I know you'll be having other witnesses soon who may be able to provide that to you.
Well, I want to, on behalf of the committee, I want to thank both of you. Sorry, Mr. Strahl?
And forgive me, sorry, but I think we all want to thank the witnesses. I would just on a point of order or clarification, the email notice that we received indicated that the witnesses would be here till 5:10 Eastern time, and then I noticed perhaps a different notice. So I just wanted to get some clarification. Obviously, we have 2 or 3 members who haven't had an opportunity to ask, and I just wanted to, if the witnesses have to go, they have to go. But if there was time to go for another, at least one more round, so Mr. Lewis from our side, I see Mr. Housefather and Ms. Romanato, I think we could easily do 5 minutes for each, and then everyone would have an opportunity to participate. I would seek the unanimous consent. If, again, depending on the availability of the witnesses, I would seek the unanimous consent of the committee to allow for those 3 members to have a 5-minute round each.
Is that okay with everybody?
I'm by me.
Okay. So what names did you say, Mr. Lewis? Ms. Romanato? And who else?
Mr. Housefather, I believe. I'd like to advocate for him as well, and I think then everyone would have had an opportunity
Okay.
to
That's fine.
participate.
So 5 minutes each? Are the witnesses okay with staying? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay, so why don't we go to Mr. Lewis for 5 minutes?
Well, thank you so very much. I certainly appreciate that. Thank you for the time, and I'll make it as worthwhile as I possibly can. Thank you very much, witnesses, and thank you to the committee for allowing me to speak. So my riding of Essex sits very, very closely to the busiest international border in North America, and uh, the movement of goods, commerce, if you will, truly goes hand in hand with the movement of people. So what I mean by that is we here in Windsor, Essex, manufacturing, auto, um, space industry, um, we are losing business, we are losing jobs, hand over fist. And earlier on, one of the witnesses, and forgive me, I forget who it was, had mentioned that there's a process in place at the border, and I'm not sure if that process is really very strong. So what's happening is because we cannot get our American counterparts onto our shop factory floors in Windsor, Essex to look at a part, what happened just last week is they literally took a seat, an electric seat, out of a car and had to ship it over to Canada, which takes days. So we're losing contracts. My question is, has there been any discussion between Canada and the U.S. governments with regard to broadening the definition of the contractual obligation? So our Canadian industries, manufacturing companies are losing business because they are under contractual obligation to have people from the US come to the shop floors, look at the part, approve it to the tune of maybe 2 hours, and then go back home and not wait in quarantine for 14 days. I believe they should be essential. And I'm wondering if there's any discussion between really broadening that definition. And we're not asking about busting the borders open, but to broaden it to allow for the contractual obligation. I would just ask either witness to please respond to that.
Maybe I'll take a crack, and then Steve, if you want to come in. Thank you very much for the question. As Steve mentioned earlier, since the border measures were put in place, they included provisions to allow the essential workers and essential goods to continue. This includes that are moving goods back and forth across the border. At the same time, I think your point is very well taken that there's obviously some companies that have been affected, haven't been able to have visitors come in, technicians to come in. And that's something that I know we have looked at. But and I do know that in some instances there have been some provisions made of where it's gotten to the point of national interest, where there's been a need for technicians to come in. There are some provisions available to allow that to happen. I'll give you one example in that regard. It doesn't perhaps fit exactly where yours, but it might serve to illustrate it. Canada, of course, is an aerospace leader, and there are, whether it is the production of airplanes or whether it is simulators, in Canada is the only place where some of this can be acquired. So those folks who need those services or who are acquiring those products had to come into Canada, and there have been exceptions made away from the 14-day quarantine. I can't speak to exactly the examples that you raised, but there have been instances to allow that to happen. I think the last comment I'll make is the arrangement with the United States, as everyone knows, has been reviewed on a monthly basis and has been extended every month. And now the additional provisions about Canadians or people entering Canada having to go through testing is in place until April 30th. These are measures that are reviewed on a regular basis, and I think it's everyone wants to see them eliminated as soon as possible, but it will be very much guided by the science and guided by those experts who will be able to tell us when the time is right to begin to relax them. But your point is very well noted in terms of the critical industries and the need to get access to specific people in order to keep sales moving.
Thank you. And I know I'm going to run out of time here, Mr. Chair. Can you just give me an idea how much time I have left?
40 seconds.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the answer. I appreciate that. So we're talking to the tune of somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 individuals is what I'm talking about locally. And I'm trying to look from 100,000 feet, but locally 200 to 300 individuals to save $100 million worth of economy, of commerce, trade, as an example. And so I really think we need to focus very, very strongly on how we can not only save jobs, create the economy, but this is not that these people need to be, in my opinion, need to be deemed essential. I used to work in the United States myself. I had an L1A visa for years, and there's about 8 to 10,000 visas out there that are being affected. So it's very serious, and we need to hit it with a really big baseball bat. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for indulging me with this time.
Next, we have Ms. Romanato for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the two witnesses. So I don't want to repeat some of the questions that my colleagues had asked previously, but I want to focus on two issues. The first one is United States President has just said publicly, and I want to make sure I don't say this, get it wrong, U.S. will now have enough vaccine for every American adult by the end of May. Further to comments from my colleague, MP Alice Lev, regarding criteria for reconsideration of border openings. And I know you mentioned that, yes, we do this on a monthly basis, usually the 21st of the month. Since we've heard reports that the United States would not provide vaccines to Canada until all of their citizens are vaccinated, can we anticipate that, given this new information regarding vaccines in rollout in the United States, that there is a possibility of increased collaboration with respect to procuring vaccines from the United States as of the end of May?
Thanks for the question. I apologize. I'm not involved in the procurement of vaccines, so I wouldn't have those details.
But given the fact that during the bilateral meeting, this was something that, of course, is top of mind, and given our continental security, I would anticipate that this will be a conversation between Canada and the United States with respect to increasing access to vaccines. Is it safe to assume this?
I think that's a safe assumption. I also think it's a safe assumption that Canada will continue to pursue vaccines that have been approved by Canada wherever they may be available.
Thank you. And I want to go now on to further to comments made by my colleague, MP McKay. I had the opportunity in 2016 to visit NORAD as part of the National Defense Committee, and spent the first 4 years of my first mandate on the National Defense Committee. Can you talk a little bit about that important relationship with respect to NORAD? We know that the North Warning System is looking at an upgrade. Canada is in the search for fighter jet replacement, and we know that there are two companies that are in the running in the United States for possible replacement. If you can elaborate a little more on the importance of defense of our continent, the continental defense grid, and also the importance of looking at that from a holistic point of view with the relationship with the United States.
Sure. Well, I think, as everybody knows, I mean, NORAD is the closest defense relationship arguably in the world. It has served us very well for decades now, and it's not surprising that we're going through a period of reflection and modernization. The world has changed, and it's important that NORAD remain modern. This gives us a great opportunity, especially now with, as I've mentioned, two governments in significant alignment. Gives us a great opportunity to look at all aspects of our collective security. I'm not the expert on fighter jets, so I won't go there, nor on North Warning System, but these are key aspects of that relationship. And I think not only does it serve our clear interests in terms of our security of North America, it sends a very, very strong signal to the world of what Canada and the United States stand for together.
Thank you. And I just wanted to touch that last on the possible provisions that you mentioned that we were looking at in terms of Line 5. What are some of those possible provisions in the event that the disagreement between the Michigan governor and the Enbridge for Line 5 does unfortunately happen? What are the provisions that Canada is looking at in terms of making sure supply is not cut off?
Yeah, just to reiterate that, our objective is to find a resolution to this issue. There are processes that are going on in the state court and the federal courts, and they have, in a way, a life of their own, and we're following them, and we're looking at if and how the federal government needs to be involved in those, while at the same time we have stepped up our engagement and advocacy across the board in the key states and with the federal government. In terms of the provisions, we've talked already about the 1977 treaty. We've talked about NAFTA and about CUSMA. All I can say is that we are busily looking at all potential provisions to see what may be needed and how it could be employed. And we're doing so working very closely with Enbridge and with the provinces.
Thank you, Mrs. Robinato. And for the final 5 minutes to Mr. Housefather, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Strahl, for suggesting this. It's appreciated to have the chance to ask a couple of questions. Thank you very much to both the witnesses as well. Very much appreciate your service. Most of my questions are going to focus on line 5, but I have one question on vaccines. We talked a little bit about AstraZeneca and the 20 million doses that we expect to be shipped from the United States. But my understanding is that both Pfizer and Moderna were unable to ship from the United States based on an executive order. Now, am I incorrect in the sense that an executive order is prohibiting vaccine shipments from the United States? Is it merely exclusivity agreements between the government of the United States and Pfizer and Moderna related to domestic shipments from their U.S. plants, or is there indeed some executive order related to vaccine shipments from the United States that we need to worry about?
Thank you very much for the question. Again, I'll add the caveat that I'm not involved in the direct procurement of vaccines, so I'm probably not the best person to ask all of that. But as of now, Canada has an arrangement with AstraZeneca to provide 20 million doses. And we are watching very carefully and engaging with the federal government of the United States. Our expectation is that that will be upheld, but as it is an extremely important and serious issue for all Canadians, we need to continue to be engaged.
I understand, but again, my question is there an executive order that we're seeking an exemption from related to AstraZeneca, or is there no able to sell or come to an agreement with Pfizer and Moderna to ship from the United States that we could do so? Or is there a contract between the United States and Pfizer and Moderna for exclusivity, which means we need the United States approval to get Pfizer and Moderna, but not AstraZeneca? That is my question.
Thank you. I'm afraid I don't have the specific answer. All I know is I believe the arrangements are in place, but Steve?
Would you be able to get back to the committee with that, just in writing, so I can go to my next question? Thank you so much. So when it comes to line 5, who is advising the government of Canada from a legal vantage point? If this committee wants a witness to advise us as to the government of Canada's legal position, not Enbridge's, but the government of Canada's, who would be the best witness for that? Who is advising us?
Well, there is a collective effort amongst Global Affairs, Natural Resources Canada, Justice, and others. So I think if the requests were made, that the right officials would be found.
Thank you so much. And with respect to our position with respect to common cause, I understand what you're saying is that because Pennsylvania and Ohio are also supplied by line 5, we're engaging with the executive in those states to try to help us to convince the executive in Michigan that their decision with respect to line 5 should be reviewed and hopefully reversed. Are we engaging with the Michigan legislature? Are we engaging with the Republican majorities in both chambers of the Michigan legislature that have not agreed with the governor's decision?
I can say that we're engaging with all of the above, legislators, executives, as well as key industry representatives, representatives of labor. So it's quite comprehensive.
Labor is a huge help here from both sides of the border, absolutely. But just to come back, is it Canada's position that the Michigan legislature has the power to override the executive decision in Michigan, or do we take no position on that?
That may be a good question for when you bring in the legal expert, but we see this very much as an issue between Canada and the United States, and federal law does take precedent over state law.
And then that's a good reason to get the legal briefing. My final question, Mr. Chair, and again, I want to thank Mr. Strahl for letting me, or proposing that we get to ask the questions. With respect to this committee's role, we are legislators, so we have the right to engage with other legislators and not just with the executive branch, where I understand the federal government may indeed be limited. Would you recommend that this committee seeks to develop some relationship and engage with counterparts in the legislature in the state of Michigan so that we could advance directly our position on Line 5 to them. Would that be something that the government of Canada would support?
I would say that this is very much a Team Canada issue between the federal government and provincial governments. And I think the more voices that are heard on this issue, the better.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Housefather, and I want to thank the witnesses for starting this study off in a very positive and informative way. Really appreciate the time, and especially accommodating our request to stay longer. So thank you very much, and we look forward to maybe inviting you back again for further assistance in maybe another study. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So all of you probably would have received 3 documents, one in English, one in French, and the Word document.
Mr.
Oh,
Chair,
okay,
if I
okay.
could interrupt
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
we need to switch over to the in-camera portion.
Yes, yes, that's right. Sorry. So we'll suspend, and then you'll send us the new link.
It's already in the email that I sent. There were 2 links in the same email.
Okay, so we can all convert over.